Joining me now is Jay Willis, editor-in-chief of Balls and Strikes. If you're unfamiliar with Balls and Strikes, it is a critical site, news outlet, that covers legal news in ways that we can all understand. Too often, this coverage, this reporting is full of jargon. And for many people, it's too abstract and hard to understand. But Balls and Strikes really helps the average person understand what's going on and also sees law and the legal profession as something that has real and often political consequences. So I always look to them in confusing times regarding legal news for clarity. And very few people do it as well or better than Jay Willis, who's joining me now. Jay, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Thank you for having me. And those are really kind words. And it also sort of helpfully glosses over the fact that I don't understand the jargon either, which is why I write for the website. Because as soon as the jargon comes up, I'm like, oh man, this seems like a lot. Is there someone smarter than me who can explain this?
Yeah, you could always just go to SCOTUS blog and kind of copy and paste. That should work, right?
Shout out Tom Goldstein. I assume he's a listener to this podcast. The op-ed was great,
Big
dude.
fan
Loved
of,
it.
yeah. So Jay, right now there's a big fight happening in the Senate during the waning weeks of the Biden presidency, and I'm really hoping you can help me understand what's going on there, why people should care. But first, the big story that most people probably are aware of is the indefinite pause. Maybe just the case is over, but Trump's hush money case, the sentencing is just never going to happen. What's going on there?
Yeah, the judge in that case today said that there would not be a sentencing, that is canceled. I think for all intents and purposes, the state level prosecutions against Trump, both in New York and in Georgia, they're at different places, obviously, but they are over. Again, to the extent that the prosecutors, legal systems in those cases, however they particularly choose to wrap them up, the details of that may vary, but the high level takeaway is that I do not think that those state legal systems will be putting the president of the United States in prison anytime soon. So we sort of enter this very strange space where multiple prosecutors were going after a political candidate for violations of their state law. In particular, the violation of law in Georgia was complicity in trying to overturn the results of a Democratic election in 2020. And by virtue of the fact that that candidate won this year's presidential election, those crimes just don't really count anymore under the law. They just go away, and this guy gets to be the chief executive again. As I say it out loud, I realize how obviously of a failure of a legal system we have that could produce an outcome like that. But I did not create it. It is only my job to get upset about it on the internet.
So some people might think, well, maybe it's for the best. Do we want a system where state level legal systems, judges can throw a president in jail? And if even, I think even some well-meaning people might think, well,
absolutely.
What would happen if a Republican state or, Republican controlled state might try to do that to Biden, or if we have elections anymore, a future Democratic president? What do you say to people who think this might be for the best and who aren't just purely in Trump's camp? Like, this is rigged. They're out to get him. How would you address that concern?
Yeah, I certainly understand the concern, as you say, that the challenge, I think, and you see this a lot from sort of ostensibly reluctant defenders of this result, who come from the legal profession, lawyers, legal pundits who are talking about this. This sense that, well, imagine if the shoe were on the other foot. And I guess my response to that is, first, it's not. And second of all, I think the framework just breaks down really quickly when you have a president who has committed actual crimes that are worthy of prosecution and that in fact would be prosecuted if not for the fact that he happens to have just won a presidential election. I think that if you treat as quote unquote political or a quote unquote politicized prosecution as any definition of a politician, of someone in politics, you reach this point where as long as you are filing the correct paperwork to run for office, as long as you are getting a plurality of the electorate to vote for you, you can actually do whatever crimes you want because prosecutions of you, pardon me, are inherently political. I just don't think that's tenable. It cannot be the case. It cannot be the case that under the legal system, winning elections gets you out of jail, gets you out of prison, gets you out of facing consequences. I again, I empathize with the sort of prospect of, I don't know, Ken Paxton in Texas indicting Joe Biden for God knows what on January 21st of next year. But at the same time, I just think that you have to take these cases sort of as they come. A hypothetical prosecution of a hypothetical Democratic president in the future is not a reason, in my view, for the legal system to just sort of throw up its hands and say that it has neither, it does not have the power and it would not be prudent for the powers that be to hold someone like Trump accountable.
Just concerned about safeguards in place, if there are any, against something like that. You know, a red state governor just filing a frivolous or just a frivolous indictment of a Democratic Party official as retribution to curry favor with Trump, maybe to replace Pam Bondi as AG when she resigns. I don't know. But you think about what the disincentives would be. And, you know, one of them would be, well, it's just, it might make your constituents, might make people in your state or your voters upset because you're wasting resources and you're clogging up the system and it's a waste of money. I would want to think that, but I feel like we live in such a politically polarized world right now that I don't know if there would even be backlash if a bunch of red state AGs just went after Biden next January. And I think like as that plays out, it's okay. I guess it would go to the courts. What's the response there? If it were to go to make its way somehow to the Supreme Court, is their ruling just you can't indict a president? Because it maybe like I don't know how you or a former president or some high profile political official. It just gets very convoluted, and I'm unsure how we would even respond to this. How would we stop this response of like you're saying a hypothetical frivolous indictment?
Yeah, I think the possibility of, Republicans going after Biden as part of like an audition for some sort of promotion during the Trump administration, that's been around for a while, and I think it's certainly a concern. What's specifically so frustrating to me about the Trump cases is that they're not they are no longer targeted at a former president in the way that there's this um, sensible concern about political retribution, right, against ex-presidents. What we're talking about in the case of Trump is not retribution of an ex-president. We're talking about prosecution of someone who happened to become president again, and therefore the prosecution is considered it, what, a nullity, no longer valid. I think one way to think about this is if Trump hadn't won the election on, oh God, what was it? November 6th? That was 3 years ago. I don't really remember. If Trump hadn't won the election earlier this month, all four of those cases would still be proceeding as they were. We sort of had this absurd result in which, the precise coalition of tens of millions of people that turned out at the polls on one day to elect a president, somehow the legal system is treating that in effect as an exoneration, as a not guilty verdict. I do not think that can possibly be correct. But again, I have no good way to end that sentence. Let me try one more time. I don't know how that can possibly be correct. And, this falls into one of the tests that I like to use when talking about legal issues, which is if you explain why these prosecutions are coming to an end to a lawyer, they will nod and understand it. And if you explain them to a normal person, they will say, "What the fuck are you talking about? That makes no sense." And this is one of those where that to me is what I think the right perspective to take on this is.
Mhm. And you're alluding to the Tom Goldstein op-ed where he makes that case. The election did exonerate Trump, and you have a piece in Balls and Strikes now taking it down, responding to it, criticizing it. It doesn't make sense. You're right. To the average person, that doesn't make sense. Let me correct that. To the rational person, that should not make sense. The average Trump supporter is going to be totally fine with that outcome. But he was found guilty in some of these cases, reliable in some of these cases, and it just suddenly that doesn't matter. It seems like this creates an easily exploitable loophole for high-profile figures who are facing the consequences of their actions. If Bob Menendez, for instance, was more popular and able to somehow win a presidential election, would he be in a similar boat? Would he be immune from any consequences for his actions? And I worry about what this looks like in the next cycle or 2 to 4 cycles down the road once this has potentially, but God forbid, more commonplace, where corruption is not just rewarded but totally protected.
Yeah, I'm goofing on the Goldstein op-ed a little bit, in large part just because I didn't think that anyone, let alone anyone that high profile, would be craven enough to say it in a public setting. But even if you take a step back from the op-ed, I mean, that is the functional result of ending these prosecutions, right? Even if your argument isn't that the election was a constitutional not guilty verdict on Trump, that is the effective outcome of bringing these prosecutions to a close. And I just don't think that a functioning legal system would allow people, as you say, to avoid facing potentially consequences of their actions by jumping into what are in effect very expensive popularity contests, running campaigns, and hoping for the best.
I'm naive to think that even like a Roberts would be okay with this, like a Justice Roberts would be okay with this. But I feel like if this did make its way to the court somehow, they'd just be fine with it. I don't think they would care. I think they'd be totally okay. And you kind of saw some signs of that in the immunity case. Just like, oh yeah, if you're president, you can more or less do whatever you want. You're just immune from punishment.
Yeah, I think if Trump had lost the election, there would be sort of very interesting legal questions going forward, right? In Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's case about what for what acts Trump could and couldn't be held liable. In the months before the election, Smith filed modified documents in that prosecution comporting with the court's decision in Trump v. United States, saying, okay, you've said that these things that Trump did in and around January 6th are beyond the reach of the law. Here are the things for which I, Jack Smith, can still go after him. And again, if Trump had lost, like, the court would have to answer those questions eventually. Because Trump won, like, Jack Smith is bringing those investigations to a close. He's it's been reported, I think, that he's going to step down before the transition even takes place. So, yeah, for all intents and purposes, the court's ruling in Trump v. United States was the last word on this. What we are left with is this very malleable conception of executive authority, where what the president is and is not immune for isn't really clear. The only thing that's clear is the Supreme Court is going to have the power to decide this almost on a case-by-case basis going forward, to the extent that it ever comes before them again.
And with Trump's re-election, potentially that the court could shift further to the right. And then before we get to, I know we teased the Senate confirmation fight, but I do want to get your thoughts on. I wouldn't say as much of an intense conversation now as it was maybe like a week or two ago, but some people were suggesting that Justice Sotomayor step down and Biden confirm a younger Supreme Court justice just to preserve that seat at least. God forbid something happens. She's not that old. I mean, she's older than us by a little bit, but not that old, not even the oldest person on the court, but it was just a safety precaution. This isn't even to say that he could successfully confirm a new justice. The Senate even would. There would be an intense fight for sure in such a short window. Where do you fall on that debate? Is that even something worth considering for Democrats right now in this moment?
I've written some about this. My perspective on this is that the time to talk about Sotomayor's strategic prudential retirement in order to guarantee that President Biden would have the power to appoint her successor under the narrow Senate Democratic majority. I think that's a really important conversation to have. It's just the time to have it was 2 years ago, or maybe at the latest 6 months ago after the most recent term ended. The math with the Senate calendar in terms of confirming a Supreme Court justice gets really hard. The Senate is scheduled to adjourn, I believe, on December 20th, and the end of the current Congress is the first week of the following January. So we're talking, as you and I record this, 4 weeks, right? 4 weeks from right now, which doesn't include the Thanksgiving holiday. It's just too late. And that sort of bums me out because I think that obviously Democrats learned this lesson in the most painful way imaginable by Justice Ginsburg's decision not to retire in 2014 during Barack Obama's presidency and under a Democratic Senate. And I think we also saw, in fairness, like kind of the lesson learned when Justice Stephen Breyer stepped down and ensured that President Biden could appoint Ketanji Brown Jackson as his replacement. I would like to see, in general, liberals, Democrats, however you want to define that group, I would like to see them more carefully and soberly think about seats on the Supreme Court, not as sort of lifetime achievement awards for good lawyers, but as positions of power that they have a responsibility to be good stewards of. I think there is a strong case that the best thing to do for Justice Sotomayor's legacy would have been to step down. And, I've said this many times. I will say it again for full transparency. Like, Justice Sotomayor has spent her time on the court as its best justice, and usually by a pretty wide margin. This is not about her. This is about preserving her legacy and ensuring that, again, she is a responsible steward of power. As you say, it is my fondest hope that Democrats do not have to learn this lesson the hard way again, but hope is all we can do, at least for the next 2 years. That decision is out of our hands, and the time for that conversation passed a long time ago.
Became of Biden's Supreme Court reform and potentially expansion study? There was much, a lot was said about, oh, well, he's gonna take on the problem with the Supreme Court, and like with so many issues, it was just, well, I've convened a panel who's going to review all of our options, and I feel like we didn't hear much about that ever again.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, President Biden's stance to the Supreme Court has been pretty disappointing, and of a part with sort of a long tradition of Warren era liberals trusting in the Supreme Court as sort of an inherently good institution that, to the extent that it is, doing bad things now, that it's lost its way, that it is something that can be corrected with a few tweaks here and there. And I just do not share that perspective. I do not think that's correct. A few months into his presidency, President Biden convened a commission to study sort of all aspects of potential Supreme Court reform: expansion, term limits, ethics codes, all of these sorts of things that get bandied about in Atlantic op-eds that no one reads. And basically what it came back on was term limits might be a good idea. Supreme Court expansion is not. But you could have predicted this outcome when you saw the academics and practitioners who made up the commission and noted that there were literally no advocates for Supreme Court expansion on the commission. This was a commission of, respected legal scholars, sure, but people who brought, again, a specific frame, a lens on what the court is, and brought with it this conception of the court as separate from, as independent from politics. It will shock you to learn, right, that this commission published a report of its findings, and then no one took action on it. Now, of course, Congress has been controlled by Republicans, right? So there was never going to be a bill to enact this into law. But if that was true, like, well, what was the point of the commission in the first place? I guess I'm not really clear on that. And this came to a head after the Trump v. United States decision that we've talked about, where that was when President Biden came out and said, I am announcing my support for Supreme Court term limits. We need Supreme Court reform. We need it now. And it's like, brother, it is the summer of your re-election campaign. Like, what? This has been happening the whole time. It is too late to come out in favor of something like this. And, he dropped out of the race shortly after that. But I don't see how you look at an arc of a presidency that begins with forming a commission that recommends reforms that no one takes any steps to implement, that the chief executive then endorses 3 years later. Like, that arc has to be a disappointment. Liberals had an opportunity, in my view, to respond to the threat posed by this 6-justice Supreme Court supermajority, and they just didn't get anything out of it for 4 years, and they won't have another opportunity like this again anytime soon.
They love that, though. They love throwing up a performative Hail Mary at the very end. I thought Kamala Harris calling for legalizing marijuana like 72 hours before the election was great. I think that was a very fun play.
It's like preparing for a football game, and you put together like a detailed playbook, very thick, every scenario game planned for, and then you run one play, and actually you don't do anything for the first 3.5 quarters. I don't know. The football game analogy is breaking down here. Yeah. You took a knee.
Just take a knee for 3 quarters.
You took a knee for 3.5 quarters, and then you're like, well, let's see what kind of arm this kid has.
Well, what you're saying, the window for most of these things has closed, and we're going into, like you say, about 4 weeks remaining, a little over, for Biden's term. Now there's a push in the Senate, and they'll be out for a little bit, to confirm as many judicial appointments as they can. But that is being met with some roadblocks. They got some through because some Republicans were out of town or not present to vote. They were able to do some, but now Republicans have rallied and people are going to be there, so they can stop that process potentially. There's a deal made because Republicans could otherwise just gum up the works and block these appointments. What is happening there? Help people understand what's going on in the Senate with these judicial nominations and confirmations, and what's at stake.
So let's start with the good news, which is that, confirming pending judicial nominees during the lame duck is a long, proud Senate tradition, and Democrats are keeping it up. And as you say, they have confirmed several judges over the last few weeks, and some of them are real victories. You have civil rights litigators like Amir Ali being confirmed in D.C., public defenders like Sarah Russell being confirmed. These are like real victories for the Biden administration's well-intentioned and pretty well executed effort to diversify the professional experiences in the federal judiciary. The judiciary is overwhelmingly composed of former prosecutors, that law firm partners, people who sort of have a very who are familiar with sort of one side of the parties that typically come before them, one side of the V. And the Biden administration has done a really good job of diversifying the profession, of diversifying the bench, pardon me. At the same time, you're right. This effort has also hit some roadblocks. Senate Republicans dragged out the process, forcing Democrats to stay late at night to hold some of these very tedious procedural votes. Democrats, to their credit, stayed late. Uh, jumped through the hoops that had been set out for them. But after sort of this most recent round of confirmations, leadership of both parties struck a deal that I'll basically boil down to like this. Senate Republicans are going to stop the obstructionist tactics for the pending district court nominees. In exchange, Senate Democrats are going to sort of stand down on the 4 pending appeals court nominees. Obviously, these are more powerful positions in the federal judiciary, and basically this will allow President Trump to fill those seats instead. There's a couple qualifiers here that make the deal, perhaps not as bad for Democrats as Fox News framed it at first. So I said there's 4 pending nominees. Some of them, I think, would be a challenge to get confirmed, even if Democrats tried their hardest. There are 2 pending nominees where the judges who were going to take senior status, who are going to step aside, those judges are Democratic appointees. I would expect them to rescind their retirement now that they know that their seats would be otherwise filled by Trump. So suddenly those 4 seats that we're talking about goes down to 2. Again, there's at least some reason to think that, confirming those 2 wouldn't be a walk in the park. At the same time, I do not much care for Senate Democrats sort of waving the white flag here, sort of saying, we are no longer going to try. We are not going to fight this any longer. We are each agreeing, we, Democrats and Republicans, are each going to take sort of the lowest hanging fruit available to us, and we can go home at 5 p.m. every day. We don't have to work over the weekends, and if we finish up our other business early, maybe we head out of town for the holidays, on Wednesday instead of Friday. I would like to see Democrats fighting to get these nominees over the line. I would like to see them condemning the Republican obstruction that, could sink these nominees. I would like to see them calling out Democrats whose withholding of votes is making it more difficult. I just don't care for, as another Trump administration comes on, I don't like Senate Democrats sort of resting on their laurels, saying, we've confirmed enough judges and it's time for us to go home. If you want to look at the numbers, and if you exclude those 4 appeals court nominees, probably the best case scenario, again, as you and I record this on Friday the 22nd, is Democrats getting 14 more judges confirmed by the end of the lame duck session. Coincidentally, that is 1 more than Donald Trump confirmed during his first term, which, again, that's great. I also sort of worry about Democrats just being satisfied with that headline and not again trying to get these nominations over the finish line. I also just want to share some specifics here where one of these appeals court nominees has been the subject of just a vile Islamophobic smear campaign by conservative activists and Republican senators. That's Adil Manji. His nomination has languished for over a year now. Another nominee is the Solicitor General of North Carolina, who had the temerity to defend UNC's affirmative action policies before the Supreme Court, which, in 2024 for a Republican senator is just about the most egregious bit of professional misconduct you can commit. Like these are people who would really add something to the federal judiciary. And I want Senate Democrats to want more than what they're apparently satisfied with.
I mean, you could see why Republicans would be willing to accept that deal.
Absolutely.
Sure, district court judges, okay. Whatever happens, we're just going to appeal anyway, and they're just like they've been so effective in stacking the bench for years. They'll find a way to get it, and they ultimately, if the case is applicable and they can get it up to the Supreme Court, they've got it. So they'll just appeal as much as they can. So why wouldn't they just take that deal? But then even with that, I'm wondering, who's to say they just go ahead with the district court nominations anyway? I mean, Mitch McConnell has repeatedly, I guess Thune is now the leader, but Republicans for years have taken deals or made deals with Schumer and then just never held up on their end. There was a big immigration deal several years ago. Oh, we passed this. Well, we can have a vote on an immigration package. And he just never filled his end of the bargain. So why should Democrats trust Republicans in this moment anyway?
I mean, even if you move beyond, right, these last dozen or so nominations during the lame duck, one of the most frustrating dynamics during the Biden administration has been Judiciary Chair Dick Durbin's following of the blue slip tradition, right? Which is a Senate tradition that allows home state senators functionally veto power over judicial nominees in their home state. Now, for states represented by 2 Democratic senators, this isn't an issue, right? President Biden can, generally nominate who he wants. Chances are he's going to get buy-in from those blue state senators. Everybody wins. But where this has been a problem is in states represented by 1 Democrat, 1 Republican senator, or 2 Republican senators, because you're basically handing Ted Cruz the power to say no to a nominee in Texas. And what this has meant is, the Biden administration has not gotten much done in terms of judicial vacancies in red states, and it's limited the reach of the Biden administration's efforts to diversify the judiciary to blue states, right? People in red states don't get the benefit of that. So one thing about blue slips is they only apply to district court nominees now. There's no following the blue slip tradition for appeals court nominees, but it's still the case for these trial courts. Dick Durbin has continued to observe this tradition over the objections of, me and many other people who think like me.
Largely you.
Mostly me, I would say. Yes, I am the single pioneer on this. But where I wanted to go with this is, man, if you don't think Senate Republicans are going to get rid of that the second they have the power, like on day one, Donald Trump is going to be saying, I want to fill all of these seats. Senate Republicans had better stop with this blue slip stuff. I don't know. I haven't seen anything from Donald Trump or Senate Republicans to suggest that they won't, that Trump won't immediately make that demand and Senate Republicans won't immediately, capitulate to it, or to the extent you think they're reluctant to do so at all.
I mean, I also feel like the filibuster's probably gone next Congress as well. I think all of these things that we were told were sacrosanct and storied traditions, if it gets in the way of the Trump agenda, I feel like they're out of the way.
That's exactly my view on the filibuster, which is, I think that when it is important enough for one party to do away with it, they will do so. So for Democrats, they did not think that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was important enough. They did not think that Supreme Court expansion was important enough. They did not think that any Biden legislative priority that a majority of Democrats supported was important enough to do away with the filibuster. The argument, right, is always a prudential one, that if we ram through our legislation, then Republicans will do the same. But failing to get rid of the filibuster, it just lets the other party be the first mover, and we all get to be holding our breath for the next, again, at least 2 years to see whether that comes to pass.
I feel like that's kind of what they wanted, though. They wanted Republicans to be the ones who did it. Then they can point and be like, "How could you? We declined to do this because it was our storied tradition in the Senate." And then they have the cover then to just carry on. I think they're too afraid. They have been in many circumstances too afraid to do anything that could be seen as extreme because it would validate the right's branding or authoritarian or communist, like whatever buzzword Republicans are using in these scenarios. And they kind of operate from a position of fear, and it results in this kind of ineffective, I guess, ineffective governance that we're sitting here complaining about. It's like, you could have done this 2 years ago. You could have had this study 2 years ago. You could have done all of this when you had the opportunity. You chose not to, and then you're just talking about it in the final year of his tenure or final month, the final weeks of his campaign. Like, it's so frustrating. But maybe this is kind of how they wanted it to play out, because people had to have known it's inevitable, right?
Yeah, it is very satisfying, right? If you are running a Democratic senator's Twitter account to do a quote tweet dunk about the erosion of norms. It also doesn't get you anything legislatively. Like, you still lose in the real world. And my view is that, most Democratic politicians think that things like Senate norms and rules of Washington, that first of all, that normal people know about them, and second of all, that they are important to normal people. And I just don't think either of those assumptions are right. I think Republicans have demonstrated a much better hold on the on the reality that delivering results for your constituents is the primary obligation, and norms and rules are things to be followed or avoided as a matter of convenience. I don't think Democrats have ever really grasped that.
Right. I'm totally with you. If you were to eliminate the filibuster and pass a robust package or a much Build Back Better. Like, the key part of his platform in 2020, raise the minimum wage, expand the child tax, like preserve some of these economic policies that people really benefited from the first year of his presidency, but then created an economic situation that led to Harris's defeat in November. It's hard to imagine Trump winning when you have an even more robust legacy to point to and a much better set of material conditions for people. They're not going to care about how you did it. They're going to be thankful that you did. And I think you're totally right. Republicans, I think in some ways, are very craven with how they operate with and wield power. But Republicans Democrats rather, are unwilling to do that.
You saw this a lot with the fallout from the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision in 2022. A really common Democratic, especially fundraising line during those midterm elections was, give us a bigger Senate majority and we will codify Roe. And sort of the response was like, okay, you have a Senate majority right now. So tell me why you can't do it now. Tell me specifically who is preventing you from doing it now. Who is unwilling to get rid of the filibuster to protect this? But just sort of appealing to this appeal that, if only we have a few more seats, we will finally be able to accomplish X or Y or Z. Eventually, I think voters tire of that. They tire of, being told that, if they just give $5 more next month, that we'll get to the right number. I have been watching this. I have been watching this unfold over and over again, and it is very disheartening to see it conclude with where we are right now.
I don't think the average person remembers this, but Obama did promise to do that.
Oh, I don't remember
had
that.
the ability to codify Roe.
Did Obama promise that?
Yes, yeah.
Well, see, you said average people don't remember this. I am a below average person. This all tracks. This is great.
Yeah, he promised during the campaign that, it was one of his either day one promises, which in reality is not a day one thing, but he promised that would be a top priority. He goes in, he has the majority to do it. And then after a few months at a press conference at the White House, a reporter asks, "Hey, you said you were going to do this. You haven't done it. Is this still something that you're going to do?" And Obama, in a very long, roundabout way, basically says, "Well, abortion's, it's just very divisive and people have a lot of feelings about it. It's just not my top priority right now. We have other issues we need to be dealing with." He could have done it, and he didn't do it. So again, I don't think that people are remembering that, and that's why they don't believe Democrats. I think there's a long list of little things that result in them not believing Democrats or being as motivated by you got to vote harder, you got to give more. If we only just had a couple more, I think that messaging overall is not effective. But for me, it's you could have done it. You aren't going to do it. Why is this 600% match and just a few more senators you're emailing me about going to be the thing that changes things?
It's a real bummer. Sorry for we talked at the beginning of this interview about sort of the prevalence of jargon in legal media, and I apologize for the legalese, but it's a real fucking bummer. That's what we call it.
Well, Jay, it is, but I appreciate you helping me and our listeners understand what's going on, what the process is, what this deal they might hear about in the news is, and what's at stake. Where can people follow you and find more of your jargon over at Balls and Strikes?
Oh man, so you can find everything we write, ballsandstrikes.org. Great website. 2 notes: do not go to ballsandstrikes.com. That's not it. Also, if you commit a typo, do not go to ballsandstrokes.org. It's a different website. Can't stress enough how different of a website it is. You can find me personally on Blue Sky. I am at jwillis.net. Do not find me on Twitter/X because that shit is a ghost town. I'm not there.
Jay, thank you so much for joining me.
Appreciate you having me. Thanks, Jordan.